Hello again. Welcome back to the second half hour of our KGW special, Tent City, USA. Our goal with this documentary was to try to better understand who lives in the tents that we see all around Portland and ask, how did we get here?
Tonight we've gathered a panel of experts to also talk about what's next. How do we make real strides toward a future where people don't have to live in tents along our bike paths and our parks?
We are here with Mark Jolin, the director of the Joint Office of Homeless Services. Heather Lyons is a director at the Corporation for Supportive Housing. They work on finding permanent housing solutions for vulnerable people.
Will Harris is the deputy director of Join. His group helps homeless people get off the streets and into permanent housing. And also with us, Robert Schultz with Lentz Active Watch. Robert lives in the southeast Portland neighborhood of Lentz, which has felt the impact of homelessness more than most parts of the city. By the way, we did ask Mayor Ted Wheeler to join this panel, and he declined.
For those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, our reporters, Kylie Boshi and Maggie Vespa, are also taking your questions now. So if one pops up in your mind as we go along, you can leave a comment and they will respond. So thank you all so much for joining us wherever you're watching us tonight.
Robert, let's start with you. You heard in the documentary there, Portlanders are compassionate, but, and perhaps no neighborhood knows that as well as Lentz and yours. What could we do tomorrow? What could happen to improve things?
Well, we earned the title of the largest homeless camp in America, and a large portion of that was in Lentz. And we've seen a dramatic reduction as policies have shifted and resources have been allocated to clean up a lot of the destructive kind of footprint that happens in green areas. As far as what can be done to move forward, I know in my community a sense of accountability is a big deal. If I have a crack in the sidewalk, I can be sued. If they dump heroin needles in my yard and my kid gets stuck, I can do nothing. And I think trying to find an accountability mechanism to mitigate that, because it's going to happen. There's a bunch of heroin junkies out there, other junkies, but they're not, excuse me, I don't want to act like they're the whole population, because they're not, but that impact I think is one of the worst. The derelict RVs, the car campers, plus the tent campers along our school routes and next to our parks. As we apply more services and more accountability to those, I think that helps the problem dramatically.
Yeah, it might be a smaller portion of the population, but certainly having a huge impact in the Lentz area.
Absolutely.
And also, it's not just Lentz. People all across the city are certainly feeling this. And we worked with a research company called DHM to do a survey of Portland residents and try to get their feelings about what they thought about this homeless issue in Portland. And we'll share those results throughout this discussion. And we want to start with some stats about how often people see homelessness in Portland. Just how visible is this? 46% of people told us they see someone living in a tent every day. 42% see someone panhandling every day. On average, people see tent camping 5 times a week. So again, a very visible issue in Portland.
Our survey also found that people are not satisfied with how public officials are responding to this situation. Only 18% satisfied with Ted Wheeler, about the same for County Chairwoman Deborah Kafoury. 31% are satisfied with Police Bureau, and it's the same for the job we as the news media are doing. So Mark, let's start with it. We know a lot of people are trying to help improve the situation. How do you change the perception?
Well, I think it's important to communicate effectively about what is happening out there, the kinds of steps that the city and the county have taken, especially over the last 18 months, to try to make a really difficult situation better, both for the folks who are sleeping outside and also for the housed neighbors who are impacted by the amount of camping activity that we're seeing. Specifically, we've doubled the number of shelter beds that are available in our community over the last 18 months, and we've made that shelter that addresses some of the concerns you heard in your piece that folks have about coming in. We now have a couple shelter, for example, so people can come in with their partners. The shelters we've opened accept animals, and people can bring their possessions. And as a result, we've seen twice as many chronically homeless, long-term homeless folks with disabilities in our shelters as we had a year ago. Over 8,000 people, more than 4,000 more than 3 years ago, went through shelter last year because of these additional changes. Those are short-term interventions, shelter. The next step is ensuring the access to permanent housing. And there too, we've been able to make some significant gains.
Let's talk a little bit more about those shelter beds, because we did hear quite a bit about that from the people who are living in the tents. In fact, almost 9 out of 10 of them said, I'd rather stay in the tent than go into a shelter. Will, I know you work very closely trying to get people into shelters. What do you say to someone like that? No thanks, I'll stay here.
Really, we're trying very hard to get people into permanent housing.
Of course you
so
are. But a shelter's one step.
Shelter may be one step. It's not the only route into housing, and Join does a lot of our work directly from street into housing. What we hear from people in terms of their stories on shelter are exactly what they told you in your piece. But one aspect of this that even Olive Marks and the county's investment can't quite quantify is some of these folks have real privacy issues, some related to physical and health issues. Some with Crohn's disease that might have loose bowels, that might soil the bed, that might be stuck in the bathroom when the shelter closes and shelter staff don't know how to deal. I mean, there are additional capacity issues that a shelter system does need to address in terms of some of those real personally felt issues. And I think there's, lingering, even the work that's been done, lingering perceptions of shelters as places you get sick. Places without privacy, places
Yes.
where your belongings are stolen rather than safe, places where you're not safe. So that's the perception that still exists.
It almost seems like there's a desire to leapfrog the shelter into a permanent facility. What does this say about our effort with shelters, Heather?
Well, I mean, I think, given the choice, if one of the questions people were asked is housing an option, if you wanted to move into housing instead of going to a shelter, I imagine the answer would be, yes, I would like to move into housing as opposed to going to a shelter. The reality is there's just not enough housing for folks who are,
Right.
homeless and don't have very much income. And one of the things that we talk about too that works really well for people who are sleeping outside and perhaps in tents is supportive housing, because some of these folks have been in housing before, but they may not have been successful because they may not have had the right services with them. And even the folks who are using, and even the folks who have addiction issues, there are services available, but without the housing, they're not going to be successful with those services. And without the services, they're not going to be successful without that housing.
Could I inject one thing? 'Cause,
Absolutely.
you had touched on the perception from the population to what's happening, and we hear this as a population. We hear we're spending all this money, it's for housing, it's for homeless, and I think that's where the breakdown is. What is our government doing? Well, they're putting a ton of money into housing and homeless, and we're not really seeing the law enforcement side, and that's just starting, but our law enforcement is horribly understaffed, and we, impacted communities that see our things being stolen and whatnot would like to see more law enforcement, and we don't hear that. We hear all this money given to housing. I think that generates frustration. Not that it's not well spent, but that it generates frustration. And if the local representatives can kind of tell the public what they're doing to keep our neighborhoods safe, given what's happening, I think that would go a long way.
Well, I think communication is the key, and there is a difference between short-term, dealing with the situation, and then the long-term solutions. Voters last November did pass a $250 million bond to create more sustainable housing in Portland. Should that go to supportive housing?
I think 300 units will go towards
Okay.
supportive housing, which is great. And the county has committed services to go along with those units. And that's the kind of collaboration that needs to happen. And although money has been committed to housing, we estimate the community needs about 2,000
Much more.
units of supportive housing, which is a little bit more expensive, but it's only $53 a night.
But more
which is
successful,
not that
I
much.
would assume, in the
The
long
outcomes
run.
are amazing, not only in reductions of homelessness, but reductions in emergency visit stays, reductions in jail stays, reductions in first responders having to work with folks who are sleeping outside.
So the DHM research survey also found that 60% of Portlanders think that allowing tent camping encourages people to stay on the streets rather than seeking permanent housing. It seems to have become a viable option for people living on the streets. This is something I can do, and yes, I might have to move along every now and then, but as we heard from them, it's a better option than staying in a shelter. So how do we get past that?
Well,
Do you think that's true, first of all?
Well, I think you heard it from the folks who were talking about their experience. It's not a desirable way to live, and they would like a better option. And I think the discussion about shelter for some of those folks, a better shelter, a 24-hour shelter where they've got a reserved bed, it will work for them, and they'll come inside, and we've seen that happen. And for others, it is going to be about finding that permanent housing solution for them. There are beyond that limited options for folks. So I think it isn't that people enjoy living in tents or want to be out there living in their tents. It is the absence of an identifiable alternative at the moment, and that's the work we all have to do, is help them find those alternatives.
Go ahead, Will.
Well, there's no doubt that shelters provide a crucial link in our entire system, and Join has a new program reaching out homeless services to housing placement services to shelters and safety off the street locations like Right to Dream 2 and Dignity Village. So there's a way that the system is doing a lot more to make sure that our shelters are not only in better serve the needs of the folks that are interested, but also are being transitional places of safety into permanent housing.
But isn't Right to Dream 2, aren't most of those occupants there 2 to 3 years plus?
Right to Dream 2 is really a transitional space, right? So there's no permanent. There's a community of permanent residents that is helping run the community. It's a lot of work, but a lot of those folks that are there for the night, and it's a nightly shelter space, not a long-term space. Dignity Village has some additional residents with a little more intentional community. It's a different model, but I think one of the short-term solutions is maybe some additional approach on that front in terms of regulated sites.
Robert, you're going to have to sit on our side if you start asking the questions. Sorry. That's all I'm saying. You're going to have to come over here, and you're welcome to join us.
But it's excellent programs he's talking about, but I understood that, and I said the wrong one, that Dignity Village has a long-term population. If that's how we're going to house people, then we need to address that as an alternative and find ways for the city to make that okay. Because right now, if you set up a bunch of shacks, you're going to have code issues. And there is a successful model that's working that is the kind of thing I'd like to see more of.
The tiny homes in Kenton neighborhood,
Correct.
is that what you're thinking about?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. What kind of lessons have we learned from that project where it's strictly for women, right? Set up with tiny homes in that area as transition. Do you guys have some thoughts about whether that's good or not?
So there are a number of things we've learned from that.
Okay.
One that's important, I think, and it was reflected in the survey data that you talked about, is the willingness of communities to embrace solutions if they're included in the process. So the Kenton neighborhood actually welcomed Kenton
Right.
Village in, and Kenton Village is 14 women who are still experiencing homelessness. That community really functions as an alternative kind of shelter. The idea is not for anyone to live there long term.
Right.
And because of that, we've been very intentional about attaching support services to that village.
They go right to the village.
That's right. They come on site into the village and work with the women as soon as they move in to start the process of moving out into true permanent housing. So we know that with the right support services, whether it's Dignity Village or Right to Dream, those sheltering strategies, those sheltering communities can be truly transitional and help people obtain a little bit of stability while they're working on getting back into permanent housing.
A little bit at a time.
A little bit at a time.
All right. We're going to take a quick break and come back with more questions about what we can do as a city to really improve this situation.
Welcome back. Our DHM survey found that a strong majority of Portlanders support providing social services and sanitation services at campsites. More than half said it's better to allow people to sleep in tents than to have them camping under bridges or out in the open. But only 26% would actually support the idea of allowing homeless people to camp in their neighborhood park. So Mark, it appears Portlanders, as we said, do have a compassion, but it does seem to end when it comes to their neighborhood. How do we deal with that?
You know, it's interesting because the statistic you didn't give was that more than 80% of Portlanders said that they would welcome a shelter with support services into their neighborhood. So I think it really is. There is a lot of compassion out there, a lot of desire to help. People did report feeling fear and anxiousness around the issue of homelessness. But I think if we bring the right kind of proposal or project to neighbors, they'll embrace it. And that is the very thing we were talking about with Kenton Village, is that yes, there's discomfort if it's disorganized camping activity
Right,
in
the
public
divide is
space.
camping.
That's right. But if we can come to the community with a proposal for how to better shelter and serve the folks they see around them who they do have compassion for, then I think those ideas are embraced.
Well, I do think, we're focusing specifically on tent camping just because it's so visible at this point, and certainly in the neighborhoods. We heard from Portland Police who compared their efforts to whack-a-mole. They try to control it here and then it pops up there somewhere else. So Robert, what would you like to see police do? Because again, while we see this everywhere, your neighborhood certainly has more than its fair share.
So I very much enjoy my local police officers precinct, our staff there are tirelessly working overtime to service our community without the officers needed. So I'd love to see more officers. I'd love to see community policing. I know in some other areas, Lake Oswego employs that to alleviate the need for highly trained officers and still service a lot of the basic needs of the community. I would love to see enforcement, again, equal enforcement of law. I think a lot of my community expresses that, hey, how can that guy have that piece of crap car there and I'll get a citation instantly for anything I do? And I think that inequity is what ends up causing a lot of friction between the two parties. You know, I come out of my house and you get by with this again, and there's friction there. If law enforcement was able to really do something, and that comes through the district attorney, comes through the Multnomah County, it comes through the support system that lets them do their job, and the other facilities having beds in the jails, et cetera, having, again, prosecutors to take care of the issues, basically.
So I think, Robert, you said it, that, you know, in recent months things have gotten better in Lentz, and I do think that the current mayor has really recognized the importance of not just expanding services, but also expanding investments in the ability to clean up public areas, to have more police available, invested in walking beats and the kinds of things that we know. It's not about arresting people, but it's about having regular engagement with law enforcement out on the streets, talking to folks and trying to set those expectations and creating some accountability. So I do think we're in this process of doing both, expanding social services, expanding public safety, and importantly, really integrating them better. So we've done a lot better job in the last 6 months of integrating, in part, our learning from the Springwater Corridor, how powerful it can be if public safety and social services are working together in a coordinated way to benefit the community at large, but also those folks who are still out there.
The key to this is going to be, from a perception standpoint, getting rid of as many of these tents as possible, which equates to getting people into permanent or longer term housing. Well, how do you see that happening? In a smaller piece or in like a Terminal 1 proposal that ended up not coming to fruition?
Yeah, I think our experience in housing, 365 households a year, kind of leads us to say, when you put too many folks in the same building that are really sharing the same issues, they tend to form a more negative community. And if you can put them in smaller amounts in the private sector,
Heather, what was that about?
I don't necessarily agree with Will on this one.
they can be part of a broader positive community. So I mean, that's just how we see it in the private market units that we've housed more than 10 or 15 people in. That community isn't what it is in a permanent supported housing structure where you have the type of dedicated services that you're talking about. So I mean, there's two different populations.
So you think you could do more if you had all those services?
If you have the services attached to it, and if the building is managed properly. And so if you develop community, you can develop community in a 100-unit building. And in fact, if you have people who have similar life experiences, and if you have people with lived experiences also providing services on site, you have a much better chance of having a healthier building. And it isn't just because there's a lot of people living together that causes problems. It depends on how the building is managed and how the services are provided.
Well, we want to go back to a couple of our survey results just because they were somewhat alarming, I think, maybe not surprising, but 34% of people said they had considered moving out of Portland because of the issue of the homelessness. 23% said they've certainly considered moving neighborhoods. 48% say they avoid visiting certain parts of Portland. That's almost half our population says they won't go to certain places in the city because of the homeless. Besides the humanitarian issues here, this is a terrible reflection on our city.
Can I take that a little bit?
Sure.
So this summer, I coordinated the Lentz Founders Day Fair with a partnership with Oregon Walks and Lentz Green Ring, and we did a 2-mile walking event, and we had 2,500 people come in. I think we would have had a higher number if we weren't Lentz, and the people that did come often said, wow, I never would have walked through this neighborhood. I would never come over here, but you have this fair and there's all these vendors, so that's why they came to the neighborhood. And I found that kind of striking because I live there, so I don't really think of it in those terms, but it's absolutely true. There's people that don't want to go there at night, that don't want to go there in general. We have a brand new structure put into our Lentz Park. It's beautiful, it's constantly busy, but you wouldn't really know that citywide because it's just not, people associate all the campers, et cetera.
But a lot of, sorry.
Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I think to this point, a lot of it is that perception, right, that folks have around unsafety. It was also, I think, telling that in the survey, about 80% of folks reported feeling safe in their own neighborhoods, right? And so I think
When you know your own neighborhood,
you
it
know
is
your own neighborhood,
different.
and I do think this is a topic that gets a lot of sort of public attention, and when there are bad incidents that happen, they get a lot of attention, and I think it colors people's sense of what is and is not safe out there. It's not that folks' fears and experiences aren't real. I think that's true, and the overwhelming sort of report back from the folks you surveyed was that sense of compassion, that sense of feeling sadness, and you heard it here too, that I think folks both want to have the problems addressed that they see out there, but they want to be part of the solution as
Right.
well.
Well, one of the other things that we know, though, is we see a house that's for sale right next to one of these homeless camps. I can imagine how difficult it is to do that. You walk through downtown now on the riverfront, waterfront park, and you see the homeless problem. It's right there with visitors and tourists who are wearing the visiting jerseys of other teams that are here to play football. This is the reflection of the city. What do we do about that? What's the best way, anyway?
That's tricky, right? So I can attest to the tent issue as a resident in a home and having tents pop up. I don't know who those people are. I know that the guy, my next door neighbor, is kind of a jerk, right? He's got crap everywhere and he's kind of nuts, right? But I don't know anything about the guy in the tent. I think that's where the fear comes from. And when you talk about how do you deal with like the tourist view of that, well, you can't have it. I mean, that's it. So then what do? You have to designate areas that they can be in and support them while they're there. And I think that's where this talk of the tiny house camps and things like that really comes into bear. If you want to solve what we look like, then you have to solve what we're doing with the people.
I just want to get quickly, Mayor Wheeler the other day was lamenting that this whole entire issue seems to have fallen on local jurisdictions, that there doesn't seem to be a lot of regional, state, federal, any other help. Do you think that we are getting enough help from the state and federal government?
I just don't think there is enough, period. I don't think it's necessarily not because of political will, because I do think at the state level, and I'll just speak from the state level, I think that at the state level there is an interest in doing at least more supportive housing and doing more support for people experiencing homelessness. I think it's a different experience in urban areas compared to other parts of the state, and so that creates an issue where the state needs to be fair to the whole part of the state, but also has to pay attention to the urban issue. And because it's such an urban issue, it does tend to fall on local jurisdictions, and not just here in Portland, but that's just sort of how it ends up.
Well, and at the state level, they just tip possession of heroin to a misdemeanor, and I think that's acknowledging it as a mental health issue rather than just a pure drug addiction issue. And though I don't personally agree with that, I got a cousin out in Pendleton that's like, hey, community, it's a mental health disease. That's how it should be treated. That's the
And I can speak to the federal side. We're absolutely not getting enough help from the federal government.
I was trying to be polite.
Until 1985, the federal government was adding about 200,000 units of subsidized housing a year to the national inventory. Since 2010, it's less than 25,000 nationally. So this is an area where there's been a systematic disinvestment over time, and we absolutely need the federal government to come back to the table in a real way around the housing side and then also around the support services side. And I'll say, when they do, it makes a difference. When they made a commitment on ending veterans homelessness, it allowed communities, ours included, to make massive change in the number of veterans experiencing homelessness. Without that investment, it's hard to do it locally.
I'm so sorry to say we're out of time. We need a few more hours to go on this project, but thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you at home. We have much more on our website, tentcitypdx.com.
You can also watch the documentary if you missed it. We'll have this discussion posted as well.